Hello everyone. I am back on our earlier platform. I was able to get some help from IT and figure it out. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it works. This is our fourth practicing Stoicism video, if I remember right. And this week we're looking at sections 14 to 19 in the handbook. One thing that stands out in these sections that I wanted to draw your attention to is there's a shift, I think, away from the management of aversion to the management of desire. Remember, if we go back to remark 2 early on in the handbook, Epictetus is talking about, well, what are you going to have to do if you want to achieve a sort of stoic way of life? And he mentions two things that he wants his readers to begin focusing on. This is sometimes called the doctrine of desire, but it's basically he wants you to manage the things that you desire and the things that you're averse to. Remember, these are the things that we feel strongly about, right? These are the things that, to draw on the language from today's class, the things that we are attached to, right? So what he says about aversion is that you should restrict your aversion to only those things that are up to you. Right? So you're going to move aversion away from everything that's not up to us and transfer it to those things contrary to nature that are up to us. So what are we going to be averse to then? We're only going to be averse to vicious things. He says, as for desire, initially anyway, you should give it up completely for the time being. Right? So this is different. How we initially relate to desire is different than how we relate to aversion. Right? He says, the things that are fine, right, which would be virtue, those are the things that ultimately we're going to desire. But it looks like managing our desires is going to involve something different than managing our aversions. So initially, we just need to set desire aside entirely, as far as we can. So anything that we strongly desire, we just want to try not to indulge. And many of the remarks we've been looking at so far have focused on aversion, on things that we strongly don't want to happen. And there is some of that in the remarks that we're talking about for today as well. But I do think there is a shift over to desire and to thinking about how addressing desire is a little different than addressing aversion. Okay, so let's look at the remarks. The first one that we read was 14. And here's a case where he's talking about things that we may want, and it does look like to be a continuation of the topic of aversion. We don't want certain things to happen. For example, he says, if you want your children and your wife or husband and friends to survive no matter what, you are silly, right? Because what you're doing is you're wanting things to happen that aren't up to you, he says. You're wanting things to belong to you, to sort of be in your power that aren't. And really what you're, if you want them to survive no matter what, you're basically, what you really want is for them not to die, right? So you're averse, I would say, to their dying, and you want that not to happen at all possible, if at all possible. These are the kind of things, though, that he calls them silly just because they're not up to us. On the other hand, he says, if it's your wish, or you really want, what you really want is not to be frustrated in your desires, he says that is in your power. Okay, so he sort of identifies a special thing that you might want, namely not to be frustrated in the things you desire. And he says that's the sort of thing you can train yourself in that power. Okay, if you do that, a certain possibility of freedom opens up, right? And here is where he sort of draws a distinction between being free and being a slave. And remember, this is another thing we talked about in class today, that sometimes the Stoics are interested in a special kind of mental slavery where we are not free if our happiness depends on things that are not up to us, right? So if somebody has power to either bring about or keep something from happening that we want to happen, then they, he says, are our master and we are a slave to them. To be free, he says, you should wish for nothing or to avoid nothing that is up to other people. Right? So that's the contrast. Okay, so moving on to section 15. This is interesting because the image that Epictetus employs in some ways is a very unstoic image. He compares life to a banquet. What do we do at banquets? We sort of, an ancient Greek banquet, you would sort of sit on a fancy couch, music, maybe there's somebody dropping grapes in your mouth. You have some beverages, some alcoholic beverages probably, that sort of thing. So appetite is sort of brought to the front. I mean, this is sort of, almost decadent. It doesn't really seem like, oftentimes Epictetus seems sort of, more austere, more militant. He, uses images from games and from the military and things like that. So this is unusual, but notice what he says about it. He says, you should keep in mind that you should behave in life the way that you would at a banquet. Well, what are you doing when you're at a banquet or any other social function? Is there are rules that you follow, right? Rules of etiquette, right? So if it's a banquet and we're talking about food in particular, there are appropriate and inappropriate ways to interact with, take food. Like politely take a portion for yourself as the food's sort of going around the table. And you don't try to stop it, right? You're not more important than the other guests. You want other people to have a chance to get some food as well. And you don't let your appetite run ahead of you. You sort of wait. You got to be patient, right? These are the sort of things that will help you to be a good guest at a banquet. And so the idea is, well, how do you be a good person in life? Well, what is the analog to food? What are the things that we want, that we have an appetite for? And Epictetus gives us a bunch of, these are externals, right? These are things that we have a preference for, but we still can sort of compose ourselves in the right sort of way. So he compares the food of a banquet to children, your spouse, positions you might hold, jobs, wealth. All of these, he says, if you can act toward them the way that you act at a banquet, then someday, after a lot of practice and training, you might, he says, be worthy of dining with the gods. Right? Well, who's going to be the one that's worthy of dining with the gods? The sage, right? So we're not sages. We're probably never going to be sages, but we're sort of, if we're trying to make progress, right? If we're the philosopher, we're the philosophy student, that's where we're headed. And here it's interesting, Epictetus also mentions a fourth possibility that we haven't encountered before. He mentions the special case of somebody who in life is offered things and doesn't try to take them more than their fair share, and isn't in a hurry and can wait. But when they are offered, they decline. Right? So this is a case where it's like being at a banquet and politely declining the different dishes that are set in front of you instead of eating them, but eating them in an appropriate manner. And he says this sort of person not only would be worthy of dining with the gods, they would be worthy of ruling with the gods. So there's something extraordinary about, and almost inhuman, like that, somebody who's just sort of so outside the normal human life that he wants to draw attention. And he mentions Diogenes as an example. He says, and this is Diogenes, who was a cynic. Special, the Cynics had a special connection to the Stoics. The Cynics led ascetic lives. They didn't have many possessions. They frequently were living on the street. They sort of engaged in a kind of public philosophy where they were sort of acting almost like messengers sent by the gods to wake people up and get them to pay attention to the things that are more important. Socrates once in a while has that quality, but Diogenes has been described as a Socrates gone mad. So he's somebody that lives this sort of more austere life. And that's not the Stoic ideal, right? The Stoic ideal is, hey, if you could dine with the gods, that would be good enough. And that's a sort of a more of a private role that philosophy is playing in your personal life. The cynic is somebody who has this extra mission, somebody who's going to go out and address people on the street, get under their skin, really try to ruffle their feathers. And Epictetus thinks if you're able to do that, you're special. You're a special gift sent by the gods. You would be somebody who is sort of helping the gods rule. So that's a special case. Okay, section 16. Here we turn to thinking about others, right? So in some cases we're regulating our own emotional responses, but partly that can come up in the context where we see somebody else responding in one way or another. So with 16, he says, what if you see somebody who is upset? He says, for example, maybe their child departed. They say they left home and they're going to college, or they've lost something. They lost their watch, right? They were out walking and they came home and it was just gone. And in both cases, they're grieving, they're upset, and the first thing he says is, of course, whenever there's a case like that, the first thing is it's an occasion for you to practice your own stoicism, right? Because what do you see? Like, you see something has happened to this person, like their child has left or they've lost something. That's the impression, and they are grieving, they're upset, they think something bad has happened to them, right? And what he says, the first lesson for us to take away from it, like personally, is don't get carried away by the impression. Don't let, just because they're carried away by the impression doesn't mean you should get carried away by the impression, right? And the way to avoid that, he says, is to kind of have certain thoughts available, right? This is part of your training. This is your mindset. What he says you should say to yourself is, what is crushing these people is not the event, right? Since it doesn't crush everybody, but their opinion about it, right? We've encountered this distinction before. There are the events, and then there are opinions about the events, and then there are reactions to those opinions. So if we can get in the habit of stopping and notice that it's the opinion, then the impression won't carry us away. Good. But what about that other person? That person is clearly suffering, right? Maybe not really badly, but they are in distress. And guess what? It's part of your duty as a good Stoic to take care of other people, right? Console them if you can, or support them. Maybe offer to stop by and get them one of their favorite treats from the bakery, what have you. And so in addition to you, maybe when you encounter someone who's suffering, like that's serving as an occasion for yourself, it's also an opportunity to help, right? So he says, don't hesitate to sympathize with that other person, right? In words, you can say comforting things, and maybe even share their groans, he says, like, sigh with them if that's what, but he says, this is the critical thing, take care not to groan inwardly. What does that mean, not to groan inwardly? It means, well, where do these things come, where does grief come from according to the Stoics? Remember, it's a reaction to your judgment or your opinion. So the person who is in distress, and it's real, they're under the opinion that something bad has happened. So if you were to groan inwardly, that would mean you would endorse their opinion. You would share their opinion. And he's saying, hey, don't do that. That's wrong. Okay. But that doesn't mean that you are going to be this cold, unfeeling robot or something like that, right? You're still going to look after this person. You're going to comfort them. You're going to help them if you can. It's part of what it is to be a good friend, part of what it is to be a good human being. Okay. 17 is interesting because we get a second image, right? We got the image of life as a banquet, but 17, we get the image of life as a play. You, he says, should keep in mind that you are an actor in a play. And this just isn't any old play. It's a play that's being produced by someone, not you. Someone probably named Zeus. the gods, right? They're the ones that have decided what the play is. They've decided how long it's going to be. Is it going to be a short play, a long play? It's not up to you. They've also decided what roles each one of us will play. So your role is kind of decided by them, right? And Epictetus gives us some examples. You might your role might be to play the part of a beggar or a cripple or an official or a private person. He says, these things can vary, but the point is, if you're sort of applying that image to your life, well, what's the main thing you can do? Whatever your role ends up being, and you may have multiple roles that you play, right? The key is, how well do you play that role? You can play it skillfully. That's what's up to you, right? You can put on a splendid performance, but you don't get to select the role. Now, that's something that doesn't maybe sit so well with us these days, because we like to think that we are more the agents of our own lives, the authors of our own lives, than perhaps they did back in ancient Greece and Rome. But the image that is there, like you can sort of, and it may be helpful, right? Sometimes we do find ourselves at certain points in our life where we have a role that we have to play. We didn't maybe choose it, or we were reluctantly chose it. Maybe among the choices we had, we didn't like any of them, but we had to do one of them, so we went with one. Well, now what you can focus on is doing that as best you can, playing that role as well as you can, as skillfully as you can. Okay, how about 18? This is another one that touches on something that maybe doesn't ring so true anymore in our day. Epictetus talks about a raven croaking ominously. You hear this raven croak and you think, ooh, that's a bad sign, like that's an omen. Something bad is going to happen, and you get frightened. And that to us might seem overly superstitious, but the thing he says that he wants his students to focus on is not to get carried away by the impression, right? So frequently that's what we're doing. We're training ourselves. Like, let's not get carried away by the impressions. Let's distinguish the impression from our opinions and our judgments, right? And what he said, one of the ways to do this, he says, is to say to yourself, none of this is a warning to me, right? It's only, it may not be about anything, but if it's about something, it's not about me, right? Because me, in the moral, ethical sense, is not something that the raven can say anything about one way or the other, because whether you're good or whether you're bad is up to you and you alone. So it can't be about you. The raven can't be warning you about you. All that the raven can be warning you about, he says, are things like your body or your estate or your reputation or your children, your spouse. All of these are things that are outside of your control, right? So there may be a warning, and it might be valuable information. If there was some kind of a warning, right? It might, but what is it warning you about? It's warning you about things that you have preferences about, right? You prefer that things bad don't happen to your children. You don't want them to be hurt. You don't want them to die prematurely. But that's not about you, right? So the raven may be giving you information, help you to think about something that might happen in the world that you could perhaps prevent. But the bottom line is, no matter how sort of creepy the raven's croak appears, it's not something that should ultimately undermine your sense of yourself, your composure, because that is rooted in you and you alone, according to the Stoics. Okay, the last remark for today is remark 19, and this is, I think, a really important one. It may not initially seem, but this is where he finally kind of brings out some of the differences between how we treat aversion and how we treat desire. So what he's talking about here are things that we may have desired in the past or still desire. Remember, the project is, initially anyway, set aside your desires, right? Don't allow yourself to desire anything. Of course, easier said than done, right? So, and he holds up the possibility of winning. He says, you can always win if you only enter competitions where winning is up to you. Well, that's kind of a strange idea of a competition, but what does he have in mind? I think in particular he has in mind the contest of whether you will be good or bad, whether you have good or bad, right? That is only up to you. So if it's just up to you, it means it's possible you could always win, right? In practice, we're often not going to win because we're going to do the wrong thing. But if we only engage in those contests, we could, at least in theory, always win. But what happens? There are things that we want, and these are scarce goods. Not everybody gets them, right? Things like honor, right? What if you see somebody who's honored more than you are, right? Or somebody who has a certain power. They can accomplish things in the world. They're able to, they're a big shot. They can pick up a phone and somebody will do it. You don't have that power, right? Or maybe they're just really highly esteemed. They're famous, right? These are the kind of things that we might want, and not everybody can have them. And what Epictetus says is, be careful. Here's another case where you shouldn't be carried away by your impressions, right? Your impressions are, those are good things. I want them. Those people have them and I don't. That doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem fair. One response you might have then is to envy those people or to feel jealous. But these are all based on what? The opinion that those are good things. And that's where you get into trouble. What Epictetus says is, don't get carried away by the impression and judge that those people are happy, right? Because happiness doesn't depend on those sorts of things, according to Stoics, right? He says, if the essence of goodness consists in things that are up to us, then there's no room for neither envy nor jealousy, right? You're not going to have a strong desire for those things because you're going to restrict your desire. You're going to restrict your aversion. You're going to be tracking the only things that are truly desirable and the only things that are truly that you should truly be averse to, right? Which is virtue and vice. If you only truly desire the desirable, which is virtue, well, there's plenty to go around. There's no limit. It's not a scarce resource. It's up to us. Each one of us can be good. So if that's true, then there's no reason why you would ever feel envy or jealousy, according to the Stoics, right? The only time you're going to feel envy or jealousy is if you want something, you desire something that not everyone can have. And that's a case where you have the opinion that whatever it is they have that you don't have is a good thing. So if you could disabuse yourself of that opinion, the jealousy and the envy is supposed to go away, right? And that's the way to be free, according to Epictetus, right? If you no longer desire those things, you're not going to fail. You're not going to feel bad about the fact that somebody else has one of those things that maybe you prefer. Yeah, you would like to have some fame. You would like to have that job, but it doesn't sort of unsettle you at base bottom, right? Your center of gravity, like that part of you that's sort of really fundamentally you, is okay, right? But how are you going to achieve this? He says the way to do this is by despising the things that are not up to us. And that seems like a strong word. I would say two things about it. One is, remember what Farnsworth said. He doesn't think that the Stoics necessarily mean they hate those things when they talk about despising something. He means something like that they have the attitude of, hey, those things are small. They're kind of beneath me. They're really not as important as people have made them out to be or as I've taken them to be in the past. But it does seem like, I think there's maybe a little more to it than he's saying, which is desire is harder than aversion, right? Aversion, the task is restrict your aversion. Try to limit the sorts of things that you are opposed to have happening. Desire is harder. And it may be that as part of that, at least initial project, setting aside your desires and wrestling with them, you actually have to actively set your mind against them, right? So despising them is something that you might do as a kind of corrective. Like if your desire is sort of pulling you in one way, you're despising them will kind of pull you away. And then maybe eventually over time, you'll kind of be able to get back into that middle place where you can have preferences. There are things you'd rather have happen than not, but you're not so attached to them that you find yourself losing your composure and maybe getting envious or jealous or what have you. Okay, that's it for today. Continue. I hope you continue with your training. Try this stuff out. Read it. Read a couple of remarks. Walk around. Look at people. See what they're doing. Maybe observe what you think is happening for them. But also, yeah, let what comes along be an occasion for you to sort of pay attention to your own impressions and pay attention to how you relate to those impressions. Okay, see you next week.